Hi, my name is Misha Stone, she, her, and I'm a Reader Services librarian at the Seattle Public Library. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the Seattle Public Library and Clarion West is on Indigenous land. These are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. Thank you so much for joining us today for Fantastic Intersections, Romance and Speculative Fiction. This event is co-sponsored by the Seattle Public Library and Clarion West Writers Workshop. This event is also supported by the Seattle Public Library Foundation and author series sponsor Gary Kunis and media sponsor the Seattle Times. I cannot wait to hear this amazing panel today. I feel like we have a dream team of panelists and we're bringing people together from various countries and time zones. So thanks again to them for being here today to have this conversation. I am going to be handing this over to the wonderful Rashida J Smith, moderator extraordinaire with Clarion West. And let me just introduce our moderator and host today. Rashida J Smith spends her days coordinating online students and instructors for Clarion West. By night, pre-dawn, actually, she writes fantasy and paranormal romance as Jasmine Silvera. A former editor of the Hugo-nominated semi-prozine Giganotosaurus and NaNoWriMo addict, Smith attended Clarion West's 6-week workshop in 2005, where she studied with Octavia E. Butler, by the way. She is passionate about helping other writers achieve their goals, spending time with family and friends, and keeping her year-old mini Bernedoodle, Obi-Wan Kenobi, from devouring yet another pair of scissors. Please join us. Thank you, Rashida. Take us away.
So much, Misha. Clarion West is a nonprofit literary organization whose mission is to support emerging and underrepresented voices by providing writers with a world-class instruction to empower their creation of wild and amazing worlds. Through conversation and public engagement, we bring those voices to an ever-expanding community. So I am the online program coordinator for Clarion West. And like most writers, I grew up with my nose in a book. Fantasy and comic books were my gateway drug, with the occasional space opera thrown in. And the stories that always drew me in were the ones where a romantic partnership played a strong role. As I grew older and discovered an entire genre where the emotional arc of a relationship was the plot, my heart still craved the supernatural, strange, and otherworldly. But those older romances, like older fantasy and science fiction novels, contained a host of problematic elements and a glaring lack of folks who looked and loved like me at their centers. I believe we're entering a new golden age of both speculative fiction and romance, but not without its gatekeepers and pitfalls, but with a host of new opportunities for writers to bring characters and love and the stories that have always existed to these genres. From the sublime and the magical to the stirring and the steamy, storylines centering BIPOC and LGBTQIA characters are flourishing in the romance and speculative fiction genres. Today, I'm joined by 5 authors who are tackling the nuance of building romance into the plot versus romance as the plot, the role of the happily ever after or happy for now in representation, and the future of the fantastic in romance. So first up is Essay Chant. Their novel, Peter Darling, was called a thoroughly intelligent, ingenious take on Peter Pan, with a premise that shifts from delightful to funny to profoundly moving. Novelist Essay Chant is also a prize-winning pie baker, an ardent tabletop gaming enthusiast, and they live in Seattle with a frightening amount of books and a cat who was recently described as a gooey cryptid. So quick question for you, Essay. Would you rather be able to pause time or rewind time?
Ooh, I think pause time.
Great. Next up is KJ Charles. The Magpie Lord, the first book in her Charm of Magpie series, was chosen by Oprah Magazine as one of the 27 greatest romance novels to read in your lifetime. KJ spent 20 years in UK publishing before becoming a full-time writer. She lives in London with her husband, 2 kids, an out-of-control garden, and an increasingly murderous cat. Boy, these cats are characters in this group. So KJ, rocket ship or teleportation?
Teleportation, I get seasick.
Ooh, good answer. Next up is Hugo Crawford and British Fantasy Award winner Zen Cho, whose debut novel, The Sorcerer in the Crown and To the Crown, was called an enchanting cross between Georgette Hare and Susanna Clarke, full of delights and surprises. Her newest novel is Blackwater Sister, a contemporary fantasy set in Malaysia, where she was born and raised. She resides in the UK and lives in a notional space between the two. So Zen, zombies or vampires?
Oh, not very keen on either of them. Vampires, because I do like that show, What We Do in the Shadows, so I'll go with that.
It's a great show. It's one of my favorites. So next up, the first book in Leslie Penelope's Earthsinger Chronicles, Song of Blood and Stone, was included in Time Magazine's Best 100 Fantasy Books of All Time. An award-winning author of fantasy and paranormal romance, Leslie was born in the Bronx just after the birth of hip-hop, but left before she could acquire an accent. Leslie lives in Maryland with her husband and their furry dependents. So Leslie, robots or dinosaurs?
Ooh, dinosaurs. They sound a lot more fun.
Completing our panel is author C.L. Polk. Their most recent novel, Midnight Bargain, has been called Smart, Sexy, and Sincere, an alter Regency romance with fantastical magic and very real teeth. C is the World Fantasy Author Award-winning novel, the author of the World Fantasy Award-winning novel, Witchmark, the first novel, The Kingston Cycle. They keep all their stuff in a tiny apartment with too many books and a yarn stash that could last decades. They ride a green bicycle with a basket on the front, and they drink good coffee because life is too short. A person after my own heart. So C, passwords or secret handshakes?
Secret handshake.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you again for joining us today. I'm really excited about having this conversation. I think we'll start out just kind of with the basics. And feel free to jump in, whoever's got their first, I want to take a crack at this one. Where is the dividing line between a spec fic novel with romantic elements and a romance? Is there more to romance than the happily ever after and the focus on the satisfying emotional arc?
Well, I would say there's a lot more to romance than that, but that's the sine qua non. That's the thing that you can't be a romance without. So that's your starting point. In as much as you can't have a speculative fiction novel with no speculation. So as for a dividing line, I personally think it's pretty much where both the reader and the writer feel inclined to draw it, and that may not be the same for any given book.
I think the dividing line is, something that has romance. If it's a fantasy romance or a paranormal romance, something like that, the romance is the central story. You've got a lot of other plot elements going on, but if you pull out the romance, then you wouldn't have a story. Whereas a lot of times you can add a romance into another kind of story and have the romantic elements, but they can be pulled out and you'd still have a satisfying, complete story, although probably not as fun, if you ask me.
Yeah, I think that's right. I write mostly fantasy with romantic subplots, and I think the difference to me is that fantasy romance, as opposed to a kind of romantic fantasy or fantasy with romantic subplot, has a set focus, the development of the romance, the relationship between the two or more characters, and I think the emotional journeys of the respective leads needs to support the development of the romance, to be connected to that for it to be a romance. Whereas a speculative fiction with romantic subplot, the main story would be something else really, and you just have the kind of additional romantic element.
So in a perfect world, would there be a genre division, or would they all just sort of be lumped into the same category, and why or why not?
I think there's value to having a division because I think romance comes with a very particular commitment to readers that is really important to romance readers. And, we see this all the time where people want to write romance without a happy ending, or want to write romance that doesn't center a romantic arc. And it's like, that is actually for romance readers, a very specific, that's a bond and that is a promise between a romance author and a romance reader. So I think it's valuable to me to have that dividing line so that people continue to be able to read what they want to read and feel safe reading what they want to read.
I think they're just useful descriptors. We can get really worked up kind of arguing about genre boundaries, but at the end of the day, it's kind of a rough and ready term for something. And there are two broad categories. If you're reading a fantasy with a romantic subplot versus a fantasy romance, it is a different reading experience. And it might not be that there's a sad ending for the romantic subplot in the fantasy, but it's just you might not get as much focus on the actual romance and the development of the relationship, which is what you want in a romance, really. So I think they are useful. They are useful terms, but I wouldn't kind of place too much weight on them at the same time.
I mean, they're fundamentally marketing terms. For publishers, for authors, they're our way of saying to the reader, this is what you're going to get when you buy my book. So while that's very important because you don't want to sell people something they don't want to buy, it's not at the heart. I don't think it's at the kernel of anyone's writing journey. It's you write your book. Well, I would think you would pretty much write your book and then decide where it's going to be marketed. Or you might think, right, I really want to write a romance, and you'll go into that. But it's marketing.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a way of calibrating reader expectations, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, you've got to, don't you? You've got to give readers a chance to think, wow, no, this one isn't going to be for me. This is, we've all had the experience. You open this book that's been promised that it's going to be a hilarious laugh fest, and then it just really, really isn't. But they thought it would sell more if they put "it was funny" on the cover, and it's an exasperating experience. So, I'm well behind genre divisions solely for that purpose.
The reader service is really at the heart of, and I agree with everyone else, as someone who loves romance, sometimes you're just in the mood for something very specific, to the point of a very specific trope that you want to see. Like today, I just want to read, an enemies to lovers, and we'll talk about tropes later, I think. But, some readers are very fine tuned, and some readers are kind of just like, whatever. So you give the reader the opportunity to self-select what they might be in the mood for and what might satisfy them. Because if I'm in the mood for something and, like KJ said, you're promising something and you don't get that, well, it might be a very well-written book, but my opinion about it might be swayed by the marketing. And so I think that there is something very valuable about marketing it as clearly as possible and assigning it a category that just really lets readers who want to hone in as deeply as they want to and get what they're looking for.
And I do think that the genre categories are useful to writers in that, they obviously don't drive what you decide to write. But recently, kind of during the pandemic, I've been moving more into writing romance rather kind of fantasy with romance. And I do find it helpful in that, knowing that that's kind of the move I'm making, because then you can kind of start thinking about kind of the genre expectations, the shape of the book, what sort of things should be happening. If I'm writing a book, for example, I don't know, it's got, say it's got a kind of character who's got a very difficult family, which is very wealthy. And the whole kind of story, all the kind of plot incidents I come up with are about the corporate intrigue, then that's probably not going to be a romance. Like that, then, that I can have a corporate intrigue, but it needs to feed into the kind of romantic plot. And so I think it's helpful to kind of think through that. I often think of kind of genres as kind of like labels for a certain conversation that's going on between a set of authors and a certain community of writers. And I think that's the main benefit of being familiar with that conversation, which is that you can then use that when you're telling your story to kind of strengthen your story and make sure that what you want to get across to readers is what you're getting across.
So this might be a good point to have a little advice for our writers who are watching. Are there moments that you can, or a tip that you would give them about how to identify for themselves and their own work, this is going to be a romance. This should be something for me that I feel like I want it to have a romantic element, but not perhaps carry the plot.
I should say, I might come in here from the perspective that when I wrote my first book, or the first one that got published, The Magpie Lord, I actually started writing that as a fantasy and was quite startled when it turned into a romance, because that wasn't my intention at all. The characters just really hit it off. And it converted itself
very well.
It converted itself into a romance quite dramatically under my hands. But that genuinely, I thought I was writing literally a fantasy novel with a very small, I didn't actually think I had a romantic element in there, but it just went wham. And I used to read it for Mills and Boon, so you would think I could spot a romance when I see one, but apparently not. So I think possibly don't allow, if your book is going in one way and it really feels like it's going in one way, ride that tiger, because it's a great feeling when a book actually wants to go somewhere, and don't be too hung up on if it wasn't the thing you thought you were writing.
And to a certain degree, it depends on how you write. If the whole platter versus pantser, sometimes you're not sure what it is until you get there. Sometimes you have very clear ideas up front about what you're writing. And if you happen to be under contract, that also helps you be very clear about what kind of house is this? What did they contract you for? But if you are pre-published, then I would agree, kind of let it go where it goes. Or if you're like very uptight and very tightly plotted like me, I know that I want to write a romance. And so I set out to write a romance. And then other times I know I'm writing a fantasy, and I'm always trying to make sure that I have a romantic subplot in there, because that's what I like to read. And so sometimes it's just a matter of what the idea is and how it comes to you.
I think one thing that can be helpful too is, obviously you don't need to keep to a beat sheet. You can go wild with how you plot your book, but it can be helpful to look through things like that and see like which of these beats sound like they would be fun for me with these characters. And if you look at like a romance beat sheet and you're like, man, I really want my main couple to have all of these moments. Maybe you want to write a romance, maybe you are drifting more in the direction of wanting that relationship to be the main thing as opposed to being supporting to a main plot. I don't know. I'm a big fan of the notion that none of us are that original, and it's really valuable to look at structurally how other stories are told. So I think if you can compare to the structures of other stories and see like, well, do I want to be more like this or do I want to be like that? That can be a helpful way to disambiguate that.
Have you ever moved into a book or plot that has surprised you with the amount of romance or the lack of it in your plotting and in your drafting?
Actually, no. Basically, I just kind of decide what it's going to be, and then I write that thing. I think that maybe sometimes when it's out there, people think it's a different thing from what I think it is. But at that point, it's really none of my business, is it?
That's a lovely segue, actually, into talking a little bit about reader expectation and interaction with both the genres. I know, and tropes, especially, as Leslie touched on, romance readers are known for being extremely savvy in the way that they look for a book by the tropes, or they can identify exactly what they're looking for. This is a broad generalization, so apologies to anyone on either side of this, but you often will hear, the expression too tropey or cliche gets bandied about a little bit more, I think, in some of the speculative fiction genres. So you talk a little bit about how, from your experience as a reader too, that reader interaction with tropes and understanding the metadata of a book and how you process as you're reading, and how that maybe you interact with your readers that way. And how you view, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I was going to say, I think with that question, I think it's right that romance readers are obviously very comfortable with tropes and definitely very kind of, not unashamed about it. Kind of, if I want to read an enemies to lovers where they happen to, there's only one bit at the end and they're forced to share it, that's what I'm going to ask for. And I'm not embarrassed about that. But I do think SFF has its own tropes, and, they're just different sorts of tropes. Like, people will say, really feeling like reading a generationships, book today, or I want to read a big epic fantasy where there's kind of a battle between dark and light, and like specifically those kind of historically loaded terms, and that's kind of what the sort of tropes I think that SFF readers go for. They're just kind of they're kind of, because of the nature of genre, they're just different tropes. And I guess it goes back to this, what I was saying about me thinking about genres as kind of conversations. And for me, these tropes are kind of storytelling tools. They're often vehicles of pleasure. So they're often very enjoyable tropes to play with. The reason why we want that book about enemies to lovers, or that reason we want to read about generationships, is because we've read all these other stories about generationships and we know there's kind of specific pleasures of that experience. And we want to see that trope further explored. So I think knowing, kind of having a fairly good sense of the kind of history of a trope, or I guess how it's been used before, other books that have used that trope, it is quite important to a writer, because then you get a better sense of what readers are actually looking for when they want to read a book with that trope. And it kind of gives you ideas for how, your own take on them.
Seems to me that, I mean, basically, most of the time, people, when you pick up a book, you want something familiar, and you also want something new. I mean, romance readers are really keen on something familiar. I want an enemies to lover. I want a romance. People who don't read romance are like, but you know how it's going to end. Yes, that's the point. You don't always want to be surprised, or rather, you want the familiar thing done, but you want to see it done in a new way. I want to read an enemies to lover that is like the enemies to lovers I've read before, and also not. And maybe just because it's the characters, or maybe because it's a really exciting new twist, which, as Zen says, is comes down to knowing the history. But I do think that is basically exactly the same for SFF. They're a science fiction author may be trying to present this completely excitingly new world, but they'll still be playing with bringing a familiarity to it, making the reader familiar with it. So the whole thing is a balance between the new and the new and strange, and the familiar and comforting almost, or at least the familiar. Many of these tropes aren't necessarily comforting.
But SFF is so infamous for series as well, right? And really long series. And I think that absolutely goes to what you're saying about familiarity, which is that people just want more of the same but a bit different. And I'm like that by my favorite authors and books and series, so fair enough.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think I've always thought it's a little bit interesting that romance gets this accusation flung at them that the stories are too tropey and too cliche from people who absolutely accept the idea that the things that we find in SFF novels are dramatic situations, without ever once acknowledging that it is exactly the same thing. It's just given a different name. It has different marketing. It's like, oh, well, I mean, my repeated dramatic situations come from Aristotle. Yours.
Yes. Yeah, with me, it's the classic. With you, it's a cliche.
Yeah, or like the classic power fantasy, right? Where I think one really common story in SFF is someone who's not very powerful coming into their power, whether it's a magical power or a science fictional power, whatever it is, or they've conquered the galaxy. Yeah, but I mean, I think it's a bit like how literary fiction doesn't think of itself as a genre, even though it obviously is.
So enemies to lovers has been bandied around a lot in this panel. So let's just get it out on the table. What's everybody's favorite tropes? See, you're up first.
Oh, me. Oh, I love me a fake dating story. Oh my gosh. Give me a buddy who's come to help you out because you're going to be judged because you don't have a relationship. And then and then you get to the hotel and there's only one bed. Bring me this. More of this, please.
Yes, me too. I love the fake relationships, fake fiance, fake marriages, all the way down the line. Enemies to lovers is also one of my favorite tropes. And then, those are probably the top two.
I really like kind of forced proximity. So often, fake relationships are one version, but an arranged marriage, I really like that kind of story as well. Yeah, I've just completely blanked out the other trope I was going to mention, but forced proximity, I'm very keen on.
I love all three of the ones mentioned. I'm not actually a trope-driven reader. I'm what Elle called whatever reader. It's it's the execution. So I'm even when I think, I don't like that trope at all, then a book will come along that just does it brilliantly, and I love it. So, but I'm a sucker for false proximity most of the time.
I'm currently writing enemies to lovers with fake dating, and there's only one bed, and that's basically me in a nutshell.
Yes,
bring it to me.
I didn't realize at some point that most of mine are forced proximity, and I was like, I guess I like that. I like putting two people in a room and making them sort it out, and then oops, we fell in love. That's a fun one.
Like a sexy get along shirt.
We've talked a lot about the big genre picture. Let's talk about your own writing. All of you are centering characters that both romance and speculative fiction have traditionally often sidelined, stereotyped, or ignored completely. So talk a little bit about the importance of that representational element in your work, either personally or in the larger conversation within the genre.
I think for me, it comes back to a lot of that conversation about what is familiar and what is strange. Because I think when you're writing speculative fiction, you want to have both of those elements in there to ground your readers with the familiar and then excite them with the strange. But that goes to a very toxic place a lot of times when we talk about like certain people getting to be the familiar and other people getting to be the strange, where you don't see certain people represented as much in speculative fiction because authors don't see them as quote unquote normal. You have to write special books about queer people and people of color. You can't simultaneously have an exciting new fantasy element and somebody who you don't see as regular. And when we perpetuate that with readers, that's where I think you start to get into these incredibly rigid lines about who gets to tell stories and about who. So I think there's a great deal of importance of just insisting, like, no, the people who live on Earth, those are the familiar, whether or not they're familiar to you, like the people who live on this Earth in 2022 and the people who they would evolve into 2,000 years into the future, or the people who represented them 2,000 years in the past, you know, those all need to get to be the familiar and they all need to get to experience the strange. We're in a really weird place where people can readily read about spaceships, but they expect the human beings on those spaceships to have the exact same gender roles that we do now in 2022, or more likely in 1950. Most of the time, there's just a real disconnect there between the ability to imagine, you know, fantasy elements and the ability to imagine other human beings.
I think for me, I had the experience just probably, you know, most of the other panelists have had as well growing up. But I grew up in Malaysia, reading, we're a former British colony, and I was mostly reading books by British authors and other kind of Western authors. And I was completely convinced as a child that only white people were allowed in books, you know, to have adventures in books, because that was literally all the evidence available to me. And as I was kind of growing up, like it was also very clear to me that the sort of person I was and the sort of people that I knew were complete nonentities at best to the authors of the books that I loved best. And so I think for me as a writer, kind of one of my main projects is reconciling those kind of two parts of my experience, which is, you know, my kind of experience growing up and the society that I lived in, the people I knew, and kind of the life that I experienced in books, because books were very important to me, as they generally are to writers, you know, because we start as readers. And so a lot of my books kind of, I think, are a product of that. So my first two novels, Sorcerer to the Crown of the True Queen, are set in Regency England, and they're very much inspired by, you know, my experience reading Jane Austen, reading Georgette Hare, and people like that. But they center people of color, they center queer people, and that's kind of an attempt to kind of pull those two things together in a way, and kind of almost kind of, you know, not only kind of prove that we exist, but kind of that we are important. And we get to have adventures in books as well.
Yeah, I think I agree. Like that's my same experience. It's just sort of like in Canada, as a child, like I've read tons of Enid Blyton, like, and all of these other books, especially like kind of franchise mystery books, like Nancy Drew and Trixie Belden and Bobbsey Twins and the Hardy Boys, and it's all like white people getting to do fun things, and it wasn't something that I questioned, not for a really long time. And so a lot of the writing that I was doing was about white people doing fun stuff. And, you know, I'm developing out of it, but that was like, it gets under your skin and you don't even really realize that it's happening to you.
I have some of that same experience where sometimes in my early writing, I would realize, oh, these characters are white. Why are they white? Why was I doing that? And you have to sort of like decolonize your mind and be like, okay, I don't think that I was really put here to write white characters personally. I feel like there's plenty of white authors who are doing that really well. And I just want to read books about people like me. And I want to offer that to other people so that there's more out there. And so then it becomes natural for your characters to just kind of reflect who's around you. And I try to have it reflect, so that, as many people as possible can see someone like themselves in the books, and creating, especially with second world fantasy, adult fantasy. There's still not very many, Black authors writing second world adult fantasy. And so that was something I really wanted to see, I was interested in. And as far as putting love stories into it, a lot of people say that, Black love is revolutionary. I think it's really important to see Black people falling in love, even if they're in fantasy worlds. That's even more exciting because they get to have adventures while they're falling in love. So those were things that I don't know that it wasn't really conscious at this point in my life. It was just like, that's what I'm interested in reading about. So that's what I'm interested in writing about as well.
I remember reading a brilliant quote by E. Ottoman a few years ago when they said that it was something along the lines of, some days I don't want to read a book about a trans person. I want to read a book about a trans starship captain, which, is quite important. Fundamentally, everything that everyone has just said, but, diverse, varied, accurate representation, it's obviously right, like morally right. And it's true, and almost most importantly, it's interesting. This because it's people. It's all people's stories. It's not interesting to have a small number of people's stories compared to the amazingly glorious world of having everyone's stories. So, it's artistically right as well as morally right.
That also extend to having the romantic element. I think Leslie touched upon this as, being able to show folks in love, falling in love, having satisfying relationships. There's an amount of revolutionariness that's just, it feels, for those of us living in those lives, it's like, well, that's life, but on a larger scale can feel kind of revolutionary to have that representation. And then have you ever gotten any feedback or critical feedback of the representation, even if it's your own experience? Oh, please.
It happened when I was writing Witchmark in 2014. I had this character in my mind, Miles Singer, and all these things. And when I was thinking about his workplace, I was thinking about his work wife, his best friend at work. And she was very clear to me that, like, her name was Robin. She was a surgical nurse. She was really smart. She was very practical. She was the person who was actually responsible for organizing the nurses union, all this stuff, like really, really good, really, really competent. And she was Black. And in the first scene, I have him going to talk to her outside of the hospital. They're taking a break and they're just talking to each other about stuff. And I just kind of went on. And when I had the work kind of critiqued by other writers, it was astonishing to me how many people told me that I couldn't do it, that I could not do it, that it wasn't realistic, that Miles would never speak to Robin unless it was directly work related, that they could not be friends, that Robin could not be a nurse at all, or could not be a nurse in a hospital where the doctors were white. And I was just like, did you notice that it's not Earth? Did you notice that, did you notice that you're taking this historical prejudice from a planet that doesn't exist in this story world and you're dropping it squarely on the heads of my characters? Did you notice that? But it kept happening again and again and again. And I was pretty astonished by it.
It wasn't, so this is something that really interested me because it's something that I noticed twice in reviews of two different books. And they were very positive reviews overall, actually. So the first was a novella I wrote called The Perilous Life of Jdo, which is a historical romance set in London in the 1920s about a Chinese Malayan young woman who is living in London, and she has a romance there. And then the second was about Sorcerer to the Crown, which is about England's first African sorcerer royal. I mean, he's British, really. He grew up in Britain. And in both of the reviews that I'm thinking of, there was sort of a passing line saying, well, you know, of course, it's completely unrealistic that they would have as good lives as they do, or you know, it's completely unrealistic that nothing terrible happens to them simply by virtue of the fact that they are non-white and living in historical England, you know, and it just struck me as quite an odd thing to say, because we know that historically the UK, there were many people of color living in the UK, and I'm sure it wasn't a pleasant experience at many, you know, I'm sure they did experience a lot of racism, but I mean, it's interesting that, you know, the idea that they might have actually quite okay lives on the whole, you know, the occasional racist incident aside, was like so challenging that the reviewer felt compelled to mention it as kind of a major implausibility. I mean, bear in mind, Sorcerer to the Crown has, I mean, spoilers, but has a climax where a mermaid turns herself into a giant, and then the heroine fights her by turning a bit of froth off a wave into a horse and rides out to battle her. You know, that
That's
you know,
okay.
Zachariah is the main
That's
character.
plausible. That's totally plausible.
Zachariah is being, you know, having quite a cool job, being quite well off, having loving parents, facing racism, but generally having a pretty decent life is the most unrealistic part. I mean,
People are really attached to marginalized characters being miserable. And that is, I think, the biggest piece I've noticed, which is similar stories of like, if you have a trans character, but it's in the past, they are going to contend with all these things. Ergo, they must live every day of their life in aching misery, and they'll never find love. And it's just like, alternately, no, like, A, I'm generally writing fantasy, and B, just not everyone is miserable all the time, because some aspects of their life are hard. Like, that's just categorically not true. And it's a weird failure of imagination to imagine that people might be able to, you know, compartmentalize a little bit and still fall in love and experience happiness.
And even if you do completely believe that that is true, like, it's a story, let it go.
I do sometimes wonder if the people who are saying those things are, it's sort of a warped version of trying to be, I mean, in some cases at least, and in some cases it's obviously, you know, comes from a bad place, but in some places people like, they're bending over backwards, say, I acknowledge the suffering of other people, I acknowledge so much suffering, all I can see is suffering, so I'm acknowledging it so hard, kind of thing. And they almost don't realise that what they're actually doing is saying, no, you don't get a chance at joy, because they're so busy acknowledging your suffering.
yeah, I do think it's a reaction that comes from two different places, because one of the reviewers I was thinking of doesn't share Zacharias' background. So he probably was doing a kind of like, well, probably was very hard to be a Black person in England in 1800s. Not denying that. But then the other person actually, you know, was the same ethnicity as the main character of The Perilous Life of Jdo. And I think for them, it was like almost being so imagining themselves in that situation, just getting so stressed about the idea of living in like 1920s London that, you know, they were almost kind of hypersensitive to kind of the vulnerabilities of that character's position. I think it is really interesting, but it does show that, you know, writing about marginalized characters experiencing joy is challenging on for multiple reasons to some readers.
I think a lot of readers' reaction is often just based on either misconception or ignorance of actual history and just the way people live. You know, that's what it sounds like when they're saying, oh, well, you couldn't have that character because there weren't Black and brown people in Europe in XYZ century or whatever, or there weren't queer people, or they were doing, like, they have a narrative in their head. And that's why I think our stories are so important, because, you know, we can challenge those narratives, and eventually, you know, people will realize, because if they've read enough things, then they'll stop having these assumptions about the way things are. because a lot of us are doing research for, especially when we're writing historical, we have to, and finding real stories of people who were existing and just living their lives and fighting whatever battles they had to fight, but still, being whole people and having the good times and the love and as well, and putting that forward. I think it's just a way to battle the ignorance that's out there and then the preconceived notions wherever they're coming from.
Yeah, I've had that a little bit with readers saying that most of Peter Darling takes place in Neverland. And the ending is coming out of that and saying, I'm going to live and be myself in the real world. And I've had readers, even readers who share my background, say, that's tragic that he should have to go be real. Like, wouldn't it be better if he stayed forever in a fantasy world and never really grew up and stayed forever kind of stunted emotionally and like unable to really connect with people? And I'm like, I don't think so. I don't think that's the tragedy in this reaction. And I think that comes from a place of, like Zen, you were saying, of feeling very stressed out by the idea of having this experience. But I think on the other side of that, like, we're trying to make space to imagine the joy in that. And I think that's really important.
Canonical Neverland is also quite an unpleasant place. I mean, I don't know what your take on it is like. It's
not great.
Yeah, Peter Darling is a little harrowing in parts at the beginning. I was very worried a lot. And Essa, you wrote this amazing blog post about, speaking to reader expectations about scenes that readers expect to have in books with characters of marginalized identities. And I don't want to spoil Peter Darling, so I don't know if I should say what the scene is. I'll let you describe it if you want to. But I wanted to hear you all talk a little bit more about this idea that in the book, you have to have a scene where the character comes out, or the character of color talks about being a character of color and like what that experience is. Is that necessary? When do you decide that, look, we don't need to cover that anymore because that's either been covered or that's not what my book is about? You talk a little bit about experiencing that and how you then kind of reflect that back at the reader, if you would.
Yeah, I can just say for context, the scene in question was, I had spent the entire editing process of the book trying to decide where to place a scene where my main character, who's trans, comes out to his love interest, who is cis, and being like, well, I don't want to put it here, and I hate it here. I wrote this like 50 versions of this scene, and I kept being like, this is miserable. It feels like just this horrible obligatory moment where the reader has to question whether or not this trans character's love interest will still love him when he comes out. And then I finally just wrote a version where the scene wasn't in there. And I asked my editors, like, I think that scene kind of sucks. Like, everywhere I've put it, can we just not have him come out and just kind of have that be taken for granted? It's a romance novel. Of course he's going to love him anyway. Like, can we just not? And my editors were awesome and were like, yeah, of course. The versions of this scene that you've written are miserable. And so I had this realization, though, that like, even as a trans author who hated reading those scenes in every romance novel I'd ever read them in, I still had it stuck in my brain of like, well, it has to be. And it took, like an arduous 6 months and getting multiple other people to reassure me to, get me to the point of believing that I was allowed to leave that out.
I think that it depends, on the story. Like, I have a series, there's 4 books, there's love stories in each book. And some of the characters are dealing with racial issues and their place in the world because of their race. And some of them aren't, and they're the same, race. So it's the character journey and the plot that you've written, whether you want to deal with that or not. Like some people and some stories, they're specifically dealing with it and in different ways. I can imagine that there are coming out scenes that can be done differently and that are for different purposes and have different purposes in the plot. And so, I have created in this second world fantasy 2 countries and 2 races who have a lot of conflict with each other. And that is part of, the whole plot that I'm writing. And so there's going to be that's an issue that I'm specifically dealing with and trying to do it in a new way. But then there's also times when that's not part of that specific character's plot. I mean, conflict, so there's, you decide on a character by character or story by story basis what you're dealing with and how you want to address it. And in the same way that you can do tropes and innovate and do something different, the same but different, you can address these sort of issues of marginalization and oppression in different ways that maybe you haven't seen before, or that are shining new light on it, so that it's not the same old thing where the person is mired in this, you know, sadness. It can just be refreshed, I think.
Especially those of you working in second worlds, and you know, this idea that we carry over the baggage from our lived in world to our second world.
I think it's an interesting one. It partly depends, you know, on the kind of story it is and what you want to achieve. I think when I kind of dealing with marginalizations on the page in that kind of explicit way, if I'm doing that, it's my goal is always kind of for people who share that marginalization to read it and feel a sense of recognition. You know, I'm not really out there to educate people. The idea is that it kind of goes to the plausibility of the work, the artistic integrity of the work, in fact, because I think there is a degree to which, you know, and I see this kind of sometimes kind of like well-meaning white writers do this quite a lot, where, you know, I'll read a book by them and they'll have a kind of main kind of non-white character, and you can't really tell they're not white, like, you know, and it'll just come down to quite small things that you sort of think, oh, someone who is a person of color wouldn't have done it that way. So one scene actually I think of a kind of from a recent romance I was reading, that there's a kind of scene where the male lead, who it's like a het romance. The male lead is some kind of in a kind of situation with the female lead's coworker, and the female lead's coworker is kind of weird and a bit rude to him, and they're all like, oh, coworker's being quite weird, don't know why. And I was just like, well, but like the male lead's like the only black man in this group, and like everyone else is white, and I just feel like 99% of like people of color in that situation, like, he's probably racist. Like, I mean, like they would just think that they're like, oh yeah, Martin, he's probably just a bit of a racist, to be honest. That's probably why he's being rude. And like that, it just isn't that isn't just mentioned in it as a possibility at all. I guess like the one line would kind of make that more realistic. So I think that's kind of how I view bringing in that issue of marginalization on the page. It's just kind of making it a bit more kind of realistic to people's experience. You know, like maybe some people wouldn't think, some people do kind of cope with racism by just pretend, and by people I mean like people of color as well as white people, they just pretend it doesn't exist. So they just kind of deny the possibility of it. So there that definitely is a legit thing. It's just that it can kind of strike in an odd way, because you sort of think, well, but then most people would sort of think, is he being racist? You know.
Speaking of things that we do or do not put on our pages, let's take a little diversion and talk about physical intimacy on the page and amounts of it, and when you decide to put it in and why or why not. Well, we're all writing some sort of romance here. So we have to make a decision at some point. And I'm sure some of it is determined by genre, but is also some of it just determined by your own internal story logic or comfort level, or where do you say, this is the spot or this is not the spot?
I don't know why I'm completely weird about this, because I wrote a bunch of fanfic, and I was very definitely writing the kind of fanfic with like the spicy naked scenes in it, and you know, and that was fun. I actually made it a point to like practice writing sex scenes. I was like reading other people's and like thinking about what they did and what made them good and da, 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 da. And then when it came time to write that moment in Witchmark, it was just like I was just a flat line. There was nothing. And I was like, why is this going on? And then I said, you know, heck with it, I will do it later. And I put in a scene break and I kept going. And I never did write that sex scene. There is a huge fanfic gap in that book. And I really hope people have had fun filling it, because I couldn't do it. I don't even know why. And so far, all of my books, like basically they stop at kissing, and I'm just like, why am I doing this?
Well, if speaking as again, I used to edit for Mills and Boon. So with my editorial hat on, I think you are doing it because you knew that you didn't have anything the sex wouldn't have told the reader anything you hadn't already told them. Because that's when I used to get manuscripts quite often where people would have, they hadn't read them over carefully enough, and I'd get it with square brackets, insert sex scene here, coming to the editor, like, no. But actually, you know, that's a really great indication of a sex scene that you don't want written, because it obviously doesn't have any place in the story, in the character development. So, you know, they should be there. If, I mean, you know, we're not talking about erotica, which is obviously its own thing. In a romance novel, the purpose of the sex scene is to leave us knowing more about the characters and leave the characters knowing more about one another.
Yeah, I totally agree. For me, I can feel like okay, there's going to be a sex scene here because it pushes the relationship forward, it pushes the character development forward, and without it, you're missing a chunk of the relationship. And there are books that I write that don't have sex scenes because either the relationship hasn't progressed that far. I'm having like a happy for now, as opposed to, you know, they've gotten to the point relationship wise where they're actually going to have sex. Sometimes it's a word count thing, but in a full length novel, generally I do, because, you know, I'm trying in that is a romance, that I'm trying specifically to be a romance. Or even in, because in my books that have romantic elements, I tend not to have sex scenes because they haven't gotten there. Like it's a lighter touch with the relationship building, and the character development is happening in other ways. So I totally agree that it has to be motivated, or else it's one of those scenes you can skip. If you can pull the sex scene out and you didn't need it, then you shouldn't have had it. Like it should do something and push things along.
I do think I wish that people wrote more sex scenes in non-romance books, because I feel strong. I miss them a great deal when I read things that aren't romance. And I think part of it is that I think because culturally, a lot of times we're weird about sex, and we see it as kind of a like look away from that thing. We miss opportunities to show characters at moments when we often don't see them in media that isn't romance. And I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff to explore there, not just from it's sexy standpoint, but like they're literally naked, and you are literally seeing how they treat somebody and how they treat themselves and how they view their body in a moment where they are very, very, very vulnerable. And so that's why I write sex scenes a lot of times, is because it's a way of getting characters to a place that is hard to get them. Not impossible. Like there are other kinds of intimacy and there are other kinds of vulnerability, but I think that's where I miss sex scenes and think that there are opportunities for writers in other genres to consider, like, what does this mean to a person, and what does this mean to this relationship, and what can you show with it? Because I think a lot of like throwaway sex scenes, they also wind up being very generic. It's throwaway because they don't really feel like the characters that you're reading about, or they don't really it doesn't tell you anything that you didn't already know. It's sort of like Barbie and Ken dolls smacking together because that's what sex is, I guess. So I just see them as a tremendous opportunity to, I don't know, tear your characters apart a little bit. It probably sounds weird for a sex scene, but you have the opportunity to really get in there.
This conversation, like part of the conversation, actually reminded me of the trope that I blanked on earlier when I was talking about favorite tropes. And it probably says a bit too much about me, but the one trope that I really like is when the characters, for whatever reason, are pretty repressed. Like they're not likely to have sex, whether it's because it's set in a Regency period or they're in a society which is less kind of permissive than Western society, etc. And so what that means is what we would consider very minor forms of touch are extremely important. So, you know, the touching the hand, or like the significant ballroom dance, or even, you know, or things that don't even get to touch, you know, like kind of writing a letter, being the lady who writes the letter to the man instead of, you know, and that is something that I really dig for whatever reason. So it's a trope I really enjoy. it is connected to the answer to this question, because I think that does, to a certain degree, probably explain why I don't write sex scenes. But what CL was saying was interesting as well, because I came from fanfic as well. But actually, my fanfic career has taught me is that I don't particularly enjoy writing sex scenes. Like, love reading them, love reading a good, well-written sex scene, but I just don't really like writing them. They're a kind of action scene, and I don't really like writing action scenes either. So what I've decided is to kind of lean into what I'm good at and enjoy writing, and kind of avoid, to the extent I can, what I don't like writing. And so that's part of the reason why my books haven't so far featured sex scenes. But I definitely agree. This is sometimes you write a story and you feel, okay, that there needs to be a sex scene here, because that's just what it needs to kind of push the story along. I mean, the other reason why I don't have sex scenes in my books, I think it's partly a genre reason. And I don't mean just that I don't write romance as such. I write kind of fantasy with romantic subplots. But for example, my first 2 novels are kind of Regency romances, very much modeled in the Georgette Hare style. Hare doesn't have any sex, it's kind of, sex isn't really a thing in her world. I mean, it's a thing in that it's in the backdrop, but you never see it on the page. And it's interesting because it kind of structures the rules of her society. But again, people never do it on the stage. Anyway, but it's to the degree that I once had a reader write in and say, I read Sorcerer to the Crown as an asexual romance, and I really enjoyed it that way. And I said, well, that's a lovely way to take it. Yeah, and then the other most romantic fantasy book I've written, The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water, is inspired by wuxia, which is kind of like kung fu and stuff. And it's inspired by the kind of wuxia that doesn't have much sex on. And I think nowadays, people will have heard of wuxia that does have a lot of sex in, but like the Untamed. I mean, not that it's got sex in the screen, but yeah, it's more Legend of Condor Heroes than the Untamed, to use a kind of comparison, which probably not many people watching this will recognize.
I got you.
I'd be surprised. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, see, I jumped in on you, Zoom style. I didn't mean to cut you off, please.
I think CL was just recognizing my references, which was very rewarding for me.
Well, it's been really rewarding for me to have a chance to ask you all the questions that have been bubbling around the back of my head since I started doing all of this writing romance stuff. I would love to give the audience a chance to have some of their questions answered, though. So if I can run a few quick questions by you for your input, that would be great. So here we've got one about specifically characters and relationships. So let's talk about, how do you go about creating realistic and interesting relationships between characters and making readers care about the characters and the relationships between them? What's your process for that?
Apparently, according to this panel, make them enemies.
And then lovers.
With only one bed.
You can't stop there, though.
Only one bed. Yes. They'd have to stay together. So yeah, fake relationship, enemies to lovers. Only
but they can't have sex.
No sex. Check.
Well, I do think starting off with, I'm primarily a romance author rather than primarily an SF author. So where I come from is always, what pulls these two people together and what is it that's keeping them apart? Because if there's nothing keeping them apart, it's going to be a really short book. So that push and pull, and identifying what that push and pull is at the heart of that is where I start with my character creation. Although, I have occasionally written characters who are just perfectly suited to one another, and everything that keeps them apart has to be an external problem, because their internal problem, they're just great together. And I have also absolutely written books where I'm at 60,000 words in before I actually work out what the real problem is, and I have to go back and rewrite the whole thing. But that would be it. The push and pull of why they're apart, what keeps them apart, what keeps them together.
I think that's what I love about mixing fantasy and romance, is that I can rely on the external conflict, because I'm a person that there has to be some kind of internal romantic conflict or internal personal conflict for characters, but I prefer it when it's a lot of external. And so it's not so much that, because a lot of times in like, especially contemporary romance, you fall into big misunderstandings, and it's not really that really great reasons why they can't be together. That can be difficult. But when you add in something like historicals, where it's very societal pressure, or you're adding in monsters, or, you know, dark lords or armies or something like that. All these other elements that you can put in to tear a couple apart when they're obviously supposed to be together. That's what draws me to the genre in the first place. So that's kind of a shortcut to having that sort of relationship push and pull, when it's not just people who are in their own heads and are unable to connect for internal reasons.
I think my thing about when I'm creating a relationship that is going to be like a romantic plot in one of my stories, with the Kingston cycle, all of those books are fantasy novels with strong romance plots inside them. And what I was looking at was like, my question is how does this relationship change these people? How is it different from any other time? It's like any other time, like, how is this boyfriend not like the other boyfriends? And so like relaying that experience is mostly what I'm doing. In that, it's like, I want to write a story about this particular romance because it is remarkable. And you know what? That's not realistic at all. I don't care.
Yeah, so coming at this less as a kind of romance author, there's kind of a few different ways, I think, to get readers to invest in your characters. And I kind of am talking as a reader as much as a writer. But I find a character that's been wronged in some way that often is quite effective, you know, because obviously you sympathize with them. Someone who's trying their best. But they don't necessarily have to have good goals. It just has to be something, you know, goals that you agree with. It just has to be something they really, really want. And I think that can be really compelling. And I mean, this goes more to the kind of the story itself, the shape of the story. But I think every like your main character or characters needs to have something that they need, that they're kind of lacking at the beginning, and by the end of the book, they get it. You know, and generally it's something that they need to kind of change in some way. Like maybe they need the courage to come out, or they need to believe that believe that they can commit to a relationship in order to kind of actually have a fulfilling kind of relationship. And I think in a romance, what you want, I guess, is basically a version of what CL was saying, which is that you need to kind of show how does that relationship with the other main character give them what they need, whether that's the courage to kind of make a change in their jobs that they really hate, or whatever it is, you know?
From the perspective of romance and couple arcs, how do you manage a romance with multiple couple arcs or multiple romances? Either in a single book or over a series. I guess Leslie might be able to speak to some of that.
I know how I did it. Everybody got their own book.
I tried to give everyone their own book, and that didn't work out the way that I originally intended. So I did end up spanning, because it's a 4-book series. You just kind of, you do each arc and you weave it together. And it depends on if it's, you know, there's a larger story and the romances are happening inside of it, and how do those romances both connect the characters together and then connect those characters with the larger external action plot, usually, if it's all happening in one book, or over the course of multiple books, multiple romance arcs. It does get complicated. I recommend a story Bible to keep everything, on track. But everything has to go back to character development. And I try to link the character development. The romance is all character development. And then the actual external action plot is also about the character development. And so as long as everything works together and is like this multi-strand weave or braid, that is generally how it becomes satisfying to the reader. Hopefully that helps.
World build. Oh, sorry. We move on to our world building question, because I think this ties in a little bit. And that is, do you have any advice to help people with the world building, to help with that process, or tips to help, any tips others could use to make worlds people absolutely get immersed in? I need some reading glasses, apparently.
Hmm. Well, I mean, if you're in SFF, you're probably familiar with an incredibly long document called Patricia C. Reed's World Building Questions. It is exhaustive. I personally have never even attempted to answer every single question in a single category of this list. It's really big, but it's a great way to think about how vast and complicated a world is. And so I often refer to it when I'm thinking, what should I think about for world building today? But instead of writing down a point form list, what I do is I'll take a category and then I'll be like, okay, well, I'm just going to put myself in my mind palace, my fantasy world, and I'm going to walk down the street and I'm going to observe people's food culture, the way it manifests in the world as I'm imagining it. And I think that's my main technique, is sit down and kind of mentally put myself in the place and then observe what I'm seeing as I'm imagining it, just kind of letting it go. And then I write it down and then I wonder, where did that all come from, and refine it. But I always do it from visualization first.
One of my favorite exercises for making worlds that feel real is to, you need to know, if say you're writing a book with magic, what does the magic do? And what are the exceptional things that can happen in your world? But then how do they not work? One example of this would be, I'm writing a book that is set in an approximation of the 1930s, approximation of 1930s Berlin, where there actually was certain amounts of hormone therapy and transition related care available for queer people, but it was not available for everyone. It was not available everywhere. Other people would be going to different places. Some people wouldn't have enough money. And so I think, creating a setting where, just because you have healthcare doesn't mean it works. And I think that can help make it feel more real. Nothing works perfectly. Nothing works all the time. And that tells you a lot about who has access and what. So it can tie into a lot of different aspects of what does the world look like? What do the different people look like? Who has access and who has power?
Who has the power is one of the most important questions for me when I'm writing a fantasy world, when I'm making it up. Who has the power? Who doesn't?
Now we've talked about romance character arcs, and we've talked about world building. So let's throw them together in this question. How do you balance SFF world building with romance character relationship building? Do you feel that to be a successful SFF character / romance must arise from the specific world in your book or the book?
I think your story has to take place. The world that your story takes place in is a world in which, the story couldn't take place anywhere else, is what I'm trying to say. You have to build a world in which there's no other place that story could happen. So everything is connected. And yeah, there's a world reason for the conflict. That's the whole point of world building, so that everything is linked together. And then if you can tie your romance into the pressures of that world, then that's why it's happening. That's why the story is there. So however you're coming at your initial idea, you grow the world and the romance and the character relationships together. And they're all interacting in that way where they're all linked. And a point of conflict here is going to have, ripple effects everywhere else. And then, fixing it here has ripple effects. So, for me, it's just all about that those linking factors and how they all work together to create this weaved story.
And if you're not sure you're doing it, or if you're trying to learn how to do it, or if you just like spreadsheets, have an issue on this side, have your characters on this side and say, this issue, how does it affect these characters that you really want to pay attention to? And if it's this issue only affects one person, that gives you a cue, maybe we should look at this again. Let's look at the other, let's make it more complicated. And then, an Excel spreadsheet just helped you do your world building.
Oh, see, I'm putting that one in my toolbox. That's amazing. Can you all speak a little bit to dual or even multiple POV in romance writing? I'm grappling with a romance beat sheet that dictates alternating POV, and I'm not sure this works for my story.
Oh, I have
I've
very
never done it
strong
once in a
feelings.
public book. I've never done it once. All my books are single POV.
I think for me, the decision of is it going to be single or dual POV is like it's the thing I have to know before I start writing. Yeah, it's absolutely crucial. And in fact, I'm writing a duo at the moment, and with both of them, I've been really going back and forth. When I started, I was really going back and forth about single or double. I think there's massive advantages to and disadvantages to both. I absolutely think the decision should not be made on the basis of what a creative writing book says. You know, set fire to that right now. You make the decision on, and for me, the first and most important thing is what do I want the reader not to know? Because, you know, sometimes you've actually got to withhold. Sometimes you want the reader to only see the stuff that one person sees, so that, you know, so that we keep the other love interests. Yeah, they fundamentally remain separate from the reader, just like they remain separate from their love interest, like we all humans always are separate from one another. And, you know, that way you can really play with what the reader knows or understands or believes or hopes. And the idea that there has to be one way or another, and that one is inherently better, is just absolutely wrong. You know, it's very much a craft decision. So, you know, go with your gut, that's what I say, and think about what you're trying to tell people.
And the arcs of the characters.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say the arcs, you know, if you have two characters and one has a larger change arc than the other one, the person with the less arc, you know, who changes less might not need a POV. You know, that's one of the things I think about, like who's changing the most? Are they both changing equally? And that is also a consideration.
Yeah, I had to really wrestle with this for my current book because I liked both points of view, but one character, kind of like Kate was saying, knew too much, and I couldn't have the reader know too much. But at the risk of advocating for spreadsheets, as we've already done a lot on this panel, I did finally just make a spreadsheet of like pros and cons of both points of view and what does this person know and what does this person know. And that was the only way I could finally decide, was like kind of weighing like, oh, I love having this perspective on this, but does that outweigh the reader getting all of this information? No, cut it. I don't think there's one good way to do it. I think it's just dependent on what story you're telling.
Good. Spreadsheets for win the day. Let's just end the panel there. No, I'm just kidding. We have a few more questions. So question about sensitivity readers. How often do you all hire or use sensitivity readers?
Well, I have several times. I haven't done so recently just because the need hasn't come up, but I think it's, you know, when I have used them, it has been a really incredible experience in terms of just deepening and broadening and making me aware of a whole lot of stuff. So yeah, I think, you know, as a craft resource, it's amazing, and I would absolutely commend that to anyone who's trying. You know, we always say do your research. This is another way of doing your research, but you know, you pay people for their labor. But I feel I've never had anything but brilliant experiences using them. I'm very, very grateful for everyone who's done it for me.
I approach this differently. I don't wait until after I've written the story to have somebody look at it and tell me where, you know, I created a problem. I am working on a book. Who knows if anybody's ever going to see it? But one of the characters is sufficiently hearing impaired that they don't like to talk. They don't like to talk. They use sign language, and fortunately for them, they live in a culture where one of the official languages is a sign language because it's the most universal way to make sure that everybody understands what you're talking about. And I wanted to know some things. I wanted to know some things around signing habits and things that you needed to know, because while I am hard of hearing and I like need physical hearing aids in order to hear people clearly, I don't actually know sign language. So I talked to somebody who does and is deaf, and we did a couple of meetings before I wrote a word where, you know, I got to ask some questions and get some resources and like talk about my ideas and get to adjust them before I actually started writing a manuscript.
I think that's so valuable, because I think one thing that I know about myself, and I think this is true of other writers, is when I have something actually down on the page, that's when I start to get attached to it and feel protective of it. And like, well, I don't want to change that. And you start to get like stuck. Like it's once it's down, it's sort of stuck. So I think it's really valuable to speak to a sensitivity reader in advance, especially if you know that about yourself and you can feel yourself becoming protective of an idea. It's easier if you can let it go before before you do anything with it.
I hired my first sensitivity reader with this last book, and it was such a great experience after. I do wish I had started earlier. I think that's a very good point. Talk to the person, talk before you write. But I found it was a really wonderful experience. That said, that doesn't indemnify us entirely. So like we can still potentially, all of us, either make a mistake or be perceived as making a mistake by any number of people, right? And so, you know, Zen, I want to bring this one to you because this was specifically asked for you, but I would love for others to take a crack at it if you feel like it applies to any of your experiences. That, you know, have you ever received any negative feedback from Indonesian readers for your representation of Southeast Asian and supernaturals? And I forgive my pronunciation, Pontianaks, don't align with their expectations. So I imagine the reader's expectations. Yes.
Yeah, so my answer is no. I've never had that kind of feedback. Well, I mean, there's a couple elements. So I don't go and seek out reviews. I don't go on Goodreads, you know. So there may well be loads of reviews knocking my representation of Pontianak, which I haven't seen. You know, they can knock themselves out then, that's fine. I would say that the Southeast Asian readers who get in touch with me fall into two categories. So one is aspiring writers who haven't actually read my work. Quite a lot of people are like that. So they're not going to criticize it, basically. But the other category are just like happy, you know, that I'm there. Like we are a relatively underrepresented part of the world. People regularly mix us up with South Asia and East Asia. I think people recognize that. So the Pontianak is a very well-known, like mythological kind of creature, I guess, in like demon-ish kind of creature in Southeast Asia. So she is found in Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and it's kind of like the vampire, I guess. You know, people have an idea of what she does and what her kind of habits are. But I think when people read my stuff, they recognize it like it's a take on that, like it's a take on that classic idea, and also like I think another thing about being Southeast Asian, right, is that a lot of people who are from Southeast Asia, like, believe in Pontianak. So in a way, like, it doesn't really matter whether I misrepresent them. Like, it would if they were like a group of marginalized people, but because they are terrifying demon, like, it doesn't, you know, like, I'm writing these kind of cute stories where they're like aunties as well. Like, I mean, that's cool. Like, clearly I'm just terrified of them, and that's how I'm coping with my fear. You know, I think there's a kind of mutual understanding there that whatever I write is not going to affect an actual real life Pontianak. So I haven't had any negative feedback along those lines.
I've got one more quick wrap from the audience, and then we'll begin to wrap up, because I love this and I would keep you here all day, but I know some of you are in time zones where that is not going to work. So we just need a quick refresher. CL, you mentioned a list of world building questions. Would you repeat the creator of that list again?
Okay, so her name is Patricia C. Reid, and I'm putting up a Post-it note with her name on it in all caps so that people can just kind of grab it and just put that name in there, and then world building questions in the search engine of your choice. Please choose something private and you'll be taken to the list. It's online in like 3 different places.
Thank you. So this has been such a pleasure for me to have this time with all of you. Thank you. Thank you, audience, and those of you who are tuning in with all of your questions as well. I have a quick lightning round, and then I will let you go about the rest of your time zone appropriate activity. First of all, what book of yours are you the most proud of? Essay, we'll start with you.
Mine would be Caroline's Heart. I'm really, really happy with that story.
Leslie?
Requiem of Silence, the end of the series, which was very difficult to write, but I'm the most proud of it.
DL?
Soul Star, the last book of the Kingston cycle. Oh my gosh, this book. Oh, it makes me feel so good that I wrote it.
PJ?
Duffel Blood, the end of my Will Darling Adventures trilogy, because I swear to God, I did not think I could write that book. I wrote it in a pandemic. It took me 10 long months, but I did it. I'm proud of that.
Then?
Blackwater Sister, my most recent novel. It's a standalone fantasy. It actually was relatively easy to write, but it just kind of came together. And I think it's, I just think I really leveled up with that book.
And then my final question to all of you is, where can we find you next? Zen, we'll start with you. We're backward, reverse order.
Well, I've not got anything kind of coming out in the immediate future, but my most recent novel is Blackwater Sister. I also had a short story collection that was re-released last year called Spirits Abroad. So both good reads if you would like to read more about Pontianak and the kind of terrifying demons, but with kind of like made a bit cozy. And I'm on Twitter as Zenaldehyde. So that's ZENALDEHYDE.
KJ?
I've got a bit of a gap because I'm moving from self-publishing to being with the publisher. So obviously there's enormous lead times coming in. I've just finished, as I say, the Will Darling Adventures trilogy, which is, it's not fantasy, but it's pulp adventure set in 1920s London. And I do have a Regency Audible original coming out at, I believe, the end of this year as well. So you can look out for me there. I'm on Twitter far too much at KJ_Charles.
DL, what are you up to next?
Okay, I have a novella coming out on the 8th of November, 2022 from Tor.com Books. It's called Even Though I Knew the End. Again, here's your posties so you can see the words. Okay.
You have the best handwriting as well.
I worked so hard on this. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at CL Polk.
Leslie, what are you up to?
I have a book coming out in the end of March 31st. It is a portal fantasy futuristic paranormal romance called Savage City. And in August of this year, I have a 1925 fantasy heist called The Monsters We Defy coming out with Orbit. I can see all about it at lpenelope.com. And I also have a weekly podcast called My Imaginary Friends, wherever you get your podcasts.
You can find me on Twitter at Chant, and that is like the thing you were forced to write in college, ESSAY CHANT on Twitter. I just recently republished my novel Peter Darling. It had been out of print for a little while, and I'm currently working on a fantasy murder mystery secondary world trilogy, the first book of which is probably coming out in Q4.
Oh, fingers crossed. Thank you for destroying my TBR pile, all of you. I'm very much looking forward to all of those. My catnip has been mentioned multiple times. So that is going to wrap up our panel for today. I want to thank our panelists for joining us again, viewers for watching and giving us your questions. For more like this, please make sure that you like or share this video, subscribe to the channel. In addition to our 6-week workshop, we run online classes year-round, and we host events like this one and our upcoming virtual trivia night. So please subscribe to the mailing list for the latest updates. And we will see you all hopefully next time and again soon.